The statement apartheid was better is not only historically inaccurate, but also deeply harmful. It ignores the systematic oppression, violence, and inequality enforced under apartheid, while minimizing the lived experiences of millions of South Africans who were denied basic human rights. A careful examination of apartheid as a system shows that it was built on racial domination and exclusion, and that any claims of it being better rely on selective memory, misinformation, or privilege. Furthermore, such statements are harmful because they normalize injustice, they erase historical trauma, and undermine ongoing efforts towards equality and reconciliation. I had a conversation with a member of my community not so long ago, an older member of my community, and they were complaining about how they work at a public institution and they've been working there for quite some years now. I'm thinking it's going into 40 years now. And they're talking about, oh, when it was apartheid, during apartheid, it was better because we had water, we had a good cafeteria, we had this, that, and the third, right? Which I'm like, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying, but I don't think you want apartheid. You just want a better government, right? And I just want to talk about this whole apartheid was better, especially when black people say it because it. Oh my god, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear that. So I want to talk about it, and I want to talk about why this statement particularly is harmful, why the statement is false, and why we should stop saying it. Apartheid, formally implemented in 1948 by the National Party government, was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination in South Africa. Its purpose was to ensure white minority rule while systematically disempowering black South Africans and other racial groups. Under apartheid, black South Africans were stripped of citizenship and assigned to homelands. Movement was controlled through pass laws, interracial relationships were criminalized, access to education, healthcare, and employment were racially restricted. The United Nations declared apartheid a crime against humanity in 1973, highlighting the global recognition of its injustice. Claims that apartheid was better often point to infrastructure or economic stability, but these benefits were racially exclusive and built on exploitation. Let us look at education inequality. The Bantu Education Act ensured that Black South Africans received an inferior education designed to prepare them only for manual labor. Hendrik Verwoerd, a key architect of apartheid, explicitly stated that Black people should not be trained for positions they were not allowed to hold. Another was forced removals and land disposition. The Group Areas Act led to forced removal of over 3.5 million people from their homes. Communities were destroyed and relocated to underdeveloped areas with limited access to resources. And another was of violence and state repression. Peaceful protests were often met with brutality. For example, I mentioned this last week. The Sharpeville massacre resulted in the killing of 69 unarmed protesters. Similarly, the Soweto uprising saw hundreds of students killed while protesting educational inequality. And then economic exploitation. While South Africa's economy grew during apartheid, this growth relied heavily on cheap black labor. White South Africans benefited disproportionately, while black workers were denied fair wages, rights, and opportunities. And while I was researching this, I discovered this thing called the DOP system, a particular feature of South Africa's agriculture, which was the payment of farm workers with alcohol in lieu of wages, known as the infamous tort or DOP system. The DOP system had its origins in the early years of colonial settlement in the Cape Colony, when indigenous pastoralists and coastal peoples were induced to enter service on settler farms with the payment of tobacco, bread, and wine. The idea that apartheid was better often stems from nostalgia rooted in privilege because those who benefited from the system may remember stability without acknowledging its cost to others. Another thing that makes one say this is selective comparisons. Present day challenges are compared unfairly to a past where these issues were hidden or controlled through repression. And those who say this are clearly ignoring systematic exclusion Any benefits during apartheid were not universal, they were restricted to a minority. Because a system that denies the majority of its population basic human rights cannot be described as better in any ethical or factual sense. The statement apartheid was better is harmful as it erases historical trauma. Apartheid caused deep psychological, social, and economic harm that continues to affect generations. Suggesting it was better dismisses the suffering of those who lived through forced removals, imprisonment, and violence. It normalizes inequality. Such statements risk making extreme inequality seem acceptable or even desirable. This undermines our democratic values and human rights. And lastly, it spreads misinformation. Younger generations who did not experience apartheid may be influenced by inaccurate narratives, leading to a distorted understanding of history. I don't usually throw this word around because I understand it is a heavy word. But whenever a black South African say that, oh, apartheid was better, I just have to believe that you may be struggling with internalized racism. Because the statement apartheid was better is also a reflection of a form of historical amnesia that borders on self negation. Historical amnesia in this context refers to the selective forgetting or distorting of the past, particularly the deliberate erasure of apartheid systematic violence and dehumanization. To make such a claim requires ignoring the well documented realities. As I mentioned before, the forced removals under the Group Areas Act, the educational suppression enforced by the Bantu Education Act, and the brutal repression of dissent seen in events such as the Sharpeville massacre. More profoundly, it involves a denial of the very identity and dignity that anti-apartheid movements sought to reclaim. For Black South Africans in particular, to suggest that apartheid was preferable is to negate the historical struggle for recognition as full human beings and equal citizens. It risks internalizing the logic of apartheid itself, the idea that one's rights, opportunities, and humanity were inherently limited. In this way, the statement does not merely misremember history. No, it echoes the very ideology that liberation movements fought to dismantle. It is also important to recognize the claim that apartheid was better is not simply a critic of post apartheid governance or dissatisfaction with the leadership of the ANC. Rather, it carries a far more troubling implication that a system defined by political exclusion, racial subjugation, and enforced inferiority was preferable to a one based on universal suffrage and self determination. Under apartheid, the majority of South Africans were denied the right to vote, to move freely, or to participate meaningfully in the political and economic life of the country. To suggest that such a system was better is to imply that the problem was not oppression, but freedom itself, that the extension of rights and agency to all citizens somehow led to decline. This framing shifts responsibility away from historical injustices and structural inequality, and instead places the blame on the very idea of democratic inclusion. It dismisses the sacrifices of those who fought for liberation and undermines the principle that all people have the right to shape their own futures. Ultimately, it is not just a political statement, it is a rejection of equality as a value. The claim that they came and ruined everything in reference to the ANC reflects a frustration with present day challenges, but it is both historically and logically flawed to use this as justification for apartheid era nostalgia. It is valid to critique the governance. South Africa has faced serious issues, including corruption, state capture, and inequality, as documented in the findings of the Zondo Commission. However, governance failures in a democratic system are not equivalent to the systematic legalized oppression of apartheid. In fact, the ability to openly criticize the government, to investigate wrongdoing, and demand accountability is itself a product of the democratic freedoms that replaced apartheid. Under apartheid, the majority of citizens had no political voice and no legal means to challenge the state. Furthermore, many of South Africa's current socio-economic challenges are deeply rooted in apartheid era policies such as land dispossession and unequal access to education created by laws like the Bantu Education Act. apartheid. Therefore, while the ANC can and should be held accountable for governance failures, these failures do not justify a return to or a romanticization of a system built on exclusion and injustice. Rather, they highlight the need to strengthen democratic institutions, not abandon them. The statement apartheid was better is not only factually incorrect, but deeply harmful in its implications. It ignores the overwhelming historical evidence that apartheid was a system built on racial domination, exclusion, and violence, enforced through laws such as the Group Areas Act and the Bantu Education Act. Beyond its inaccuracy, the statement reflects a troubling form of historical amnesia that erases the lived experiences and suffering of millions, while bordering on self negation by echoing the very logic of inferiority that apartheid imposed. Moreover, this claim is not merely a critique of the contemporary governance or dissatisfaction with the ANC. Rather, it implies that political exclusion, racial subjugation, and enforced inequality were preferable to freedom and self determination. In doing so, it reframes the problem of South Africa's past as one of too much freedom rather than acknowledging the enduring structural inequalities left behind by apartheid. While it is both valid and necessary to hold democratic governments accountable, as seen in investigations like the Zondo Commission, such critiques must not be distorted into nostalgia for a system that denied the majority of people their basic rights. Ultimately, rejecting the idea that apartheid was better is not denying present day challenges, no, but about maintaining historical truth and moral clarity. It affirms that no level of order, stability, or economic function can justify a system that systematically dehumanizes people. Dehumanizes people. This is not me saying, oh no, what we have now is better. No, no, it's not. Because rejecting the idea that apartheid was better is not about denying present day challenges. It is about maintaining historical truth and moral clarity. It affirms that no level of order, stability, or economic function can justify a system that systematically dehumanizes people. The task facing South Africa is not to look backward toward oppression. No, but to continue striving toward a more just, equal, and accountable society, one that fully realizes the freedoms so many people fought to achieve. My thing is, you can complain about the current government without asking to go back to apartheid. You can. Because if you are complaining about this and your one thing to say about this government is apartheid was better, I'm going to think, yeah, you are saying that because you benefited from apartheid, or you are saying that because you deal with internalized racism. Because that statement to me is very much racist. Yeah, so that's all I needed to say. If you liked this video, you can like, comment. I always forget to say share. You can share if you want, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye.